And now for someone who needs no introduction.
Okay, well, I would say it's a pleasure to be here. I'm more confident about the pleasure side than about the here exactly. Don't know just what that means, but hello to everybody. So today I want to talk about the fine structure of Hegelian negation and its metaphysical consequences for understanding the categorical object property structure. When Hegel first introduces it in the second chapter of the Phenomenology, these are only the first baby steps in his intricate story, but I think the structure that's revealed is both interesting in its own right and a cautionary tale for any readers tempted by flat footed univocal readings of such central Hegelian formulae as the negation of the negation or identity through difference. I'll be particularly concerned to contrast Hegel's order of explanation with the extensional semantics that defines the modern logistical tradition, which wouldn't really begin for another 60 years, and in some sense didn't achieve equivalent expressive power until 160 years after Hegel wrote the passages I'll be discussing. The considerations that drive this narrative of explicitation are, I think, individually all familiar. But the argumentative narrative that they jointly articulate, when suitably recruited and deployed, is a paradigm of Hegelian conceptual emergence. And it's also a paradigm of analytic metaphysical argument pursued with Hegelian conceptual raw materials. So, taking place in a setting substantially different from the Lewisian possible worlds framework within which most such metaphysical argumentation and construction is pursued today. As Lewis's doctoral student at Princeton, I learned this framework at his knee. This metaconceptual contrast can be illuminating even in the absence of antecedent interest in Hegel's ideas. The stage in the development of self-conscious understanding of empirical awareness that Hegel calls perception develops out of a more primitive understanding of such awareness that construes it as the purely passive, sensuous taking in of how things show up to us preconceptually. The overarching commitment to understanding experience in terms of immediate sensory givenness requires attributing only the most minimal structure to those episodes of sense experience. The content those episodes are understood as having is what would be expressed by what Strawson calls feature placing language, which contains expressions such as it's raining, it's night, or there is red. It's characteristic of such expressions that they lack proper, even subject predicate structure. In fact, Hegel claims that such structure is in fact implicit, even in mere feature placing characterizations of content. And the argument we're concerned with consists in him teasing out the structural commitments that are implicit in treating what's expressed, even by purely feature placing expressions, as determinately contentful. The thought with which the perception chapter begins is that the determinateness of the content, even of an immediately given sensory knowing, an act of sensory awareness, as conceived according to the simplistic metaconception that Hegel calls sense certainty, even that has to be understood in terms of what it excludes or rules out. What's exclusively different from it, not just what is, as he says, merely or indifferently different from it. So a meta difference between two kinds of difference shows up already in the contents of acts of sensory awareness, conceived according to the categories of sense certainty expressed in that feature placing language. The observable contents expressible in that feature placing vocabulary that were introduced in the first sense certainty chapter offer a couple of alternatives. The day of it is day and the raining of it is raining are different. And so are the day of it is day and the night of it is night. But they're different in different senses of different. In the language Hegel uses in the perception chapter, day and reigning are merely compatibly or indifferently different, gleichgültig, he says, while day and night are exclusively different, ausschließend. For though different, day and reigning are compatible features. After all, it can be both day and reigning, while day and night are incompatible. It can't be both day and night. The determinateness of sense contents can't be made intelligible, Hegel thinks, solely in terms of their mere difference. Exclusive difference also has to be appealed to. If the contents of merely sensory knowings stood to one another only in relations of compatible difference, none excluding or ruling out any other, then their occurrence would have no significance. It would convey no information. They'd be mere events, that's without suches, gears unconnected to any mechanism. Their occurrence is devoid of cognitive significance as any other unrepeatable events. Their differences would be less determinate than even merely numerical differences, for numbers are exclusively different from one another. Their differences would be less determinate than those of featureless Euclidean points, for again, being one such point precludes being another one, whereas merely compatibly different contents can be instantiated by one and the same thing at the same time. In fact, contents that are merely or compatibly different are elements of different families of exclusively or incompatibly different contents. Shapes, such as circular, triangular, and rectangular, are exclusively different from one another. Exhibiting one rules out exhibiting any other. And colors also form a family of exclusively different contents. What can be compatibly different is pairs of contents drawn from different families of incompatibles, red and square, green and triangular, and so on. These merely or compatibly different contents are determinate only insofar as they also stand in relations of incompatibility or exclusion from contents drawn from the same family. And it's as such that their occurrence conveys information by excluding the occurrence of other members of the same family of incompatibles. Mere difference is intelligible, but in the context of such a structure exhibiting also exclusive differences. By itself, it's too weak to underwrite any notion of determinate content. So there are then fundamental conceptual reasons to understand the notion of determinate difference as implicitly involving the meta-distinction between two kinds of difference, exclusive difference and compatible difference. I think Hegel also thinks this meta-difference is observable, that it's part of the phenomenology in a more contemporary, vaguely Husserlian sense. It's part of the phenomenology of sense experience. That is, I think he thinks that compatibility of day with reigning and its incompatibility with night is part of what we're given when we have a sensory experience of the sort that might be expressed in feature placing language by saying it is day. In grasping that content, part of what we grasp for him is its place in a space of compatibilities and incompatibilities with other experienceable contents. On this account, Hegel thinks that more is given in experience than empiricists such as Locke or Hume do. The experiences we label red and green, and those we label rectangular and triangular for him, are experienced as incompatible, as ruling each other out, while those labeled red and triangular, green and rectangular, are experienced as different but compatible. The different possibilities of combination, and so the arraying of features into compatible families of incompatibles, is a ground level structure of sensory awareness for Hegel. He sees the modal difference between the difference between red and triangular and the difference between red and green as something one knows simply by experiencing them. So one important way in which the enriched empiricism that Hegel is considering differs from traditional empiricism, including its 20th century variants, lies in the rejection of the latter's atomism about the contents of immediate sensory experience. If their exclusive differences from one another are an essential part of what's given in experience, then each has the content it does only as a member of and in virtue of the role that it plays in some constellation of interrelated contents. An experienced red triangle must locate the experience of it in the merely compatible difference of members of two different families of incompatibles, colors and shapes. The result is a kind of holism about what's immediately given in sensory experience. The atomism characteristic of the conception of sensory consciousness, understood according to the categories he calls sense certainty, is seen to be incompatible with understanding such consciousness as determinately contentful. Equally important and equally radical is the fact that Hegel's principal metaphysical primitive, what he calls determinate negation, is intrinsically and essentially a modal notion. The material incompatibility of red with green and circular with triangular is a matter of what can and cannot be combined, what is and is not possible. Modalities built into the metaphysical bedrock of his system. Possibility is understood as conceptually more basic than actuality, in the sense that an immediately given actual experience is intelligible as having the determinate content it does, only insofar as it's situated in a space of possibilities structured by relations of compatible and incompatible difference. The empiricism Hegel is considering is a specifically modally enriched empiricism. And we'll see that for Hegel, the essentially modal articulation of what's determinate is not restricted to subjective thoughts or experiencings. It also characterizes objective determinate states of affairs, whether possible objects of sensory experience or not. If the contents that can be given in sensory experience, some of which actually are, contents that might be expressed in a feature placing vocabulary, are determinate in that they stand to one another in relations of determinate negation, in the sense of modally exclusive difference or material incompatibility, then they also stand to one another in relations of material inferential consequence. In Hegel's idiom, this is to say that though they may be given immediately, the contents of sensory experience are themselves, as he puts it, thoroughly mediated. For some feature A, such as it is raining, has another feature B, such as it is precipitating, as a material inferential consequence, just in case everything materially incompatible with B, such as it is fine, is also materially incompatible with A. In this sense, scarlet entails red and square entails rectangular. Everything incompatible with the consequence is incompatible with the premise. In much the same way, even if the features in virtue of which sensory experiences are determinately contentful were construed as unrepeatable, their relations of exclusive difference from one another would ensure that they also fall under repeatables. That is, that they exhibit a certain kind of universality. For many colors are alike in that they're exclusively different from red, and all shapes are alike in that they're not exclusively different, but merely compatibly different from red. These repeatable commonalities ramify into arbitrary Boolean complexity. For instance, two otherwise dissimilar features might share not being exclusively different from A or B, but being exclusively different from both C and D. More natural sense universals are constructible using entailments defined by those exclusions. So all the features that entail red, for instance, shades of red such as scarlet and crimson, can be grouped together. And similarly, all the features entailed by rectangular form a kind. It's in virtue of facts like this that I take determinate negation to be for Hegel a more metaphysically fundamental concept than mediation, inferential articulation, and universality, as I've drawn a little picture here. The concept of negation that plays the axial role in the metaphysics Hegel introduces in perception is a rich and complex one. As I've indicated, it's introduced as one element of a dyad. This is the meta difference between two kinds of difference: mere or compatible difference and exclusive or incompatible difference. And we've seen that these two kinds of difference articulate determinate repeatable features into compatible families of incompatible features, as in the paradigm of colors and shapes. The next step in understanding exclusive difference is to consider it in relation to another kind of negation. Hegel's determinate negation also contrasts with formal or abstract negation. The latter is logical negation in a contemporary non-Hegelian sense of logical. Two features stand in the relation of determinate negation if they're materially incompatible. Here I'm helping myself to Wilfrid Sellars' terminology, itself not wholly uninfluenced by Hegel. The idea is that items determinately negate one another, like red and green, in virtue of their non-logical content. By contrast, such items stand in the relation of formal or abstract negation if they're logically incompatible in virtue of their abstract logical form. This distinction is as old as logic. It's the distinction between Aristotelian contraries and Aristotelian contradictories. Red and green, circular and triangular, are contraries, while red and not red, circular and non-circular, are contradictories. Both of these are kinds of exclusive difference. So this is a further meta difference between two species of exclusive difference. The first meta difference between compatible and incompatible differences is a structure of coordination. Neither sort of difference is definable in terms of the other, and both are required for determinateness. Together, they yield compatible families of incompatible feature kinds. By contrast, contrariety and contradictoriness are interdefinable. So there are two orders of explanation one might pursue in relating them, depending on which one takes to be primitive. One can define contraries in terms of contradictories, and so determinate negation in terms of formal negation. For Q to be the contrary of P is just for Q to implies P's contradictory, not P. Green is a contrary of red and triangular of circular, just insofar as green implies not red and triangular implies not circular. Or, going the other way around, one can define contradictories in terms of contraries. So formal negation in terms of determinate negation. For something to be the contrary of P, to be not P, is just to be the minimal contrary of P, in the sense of being implied by every contrary of P, every contrary Q of P. Not red is implied by all of red's contraries, green, blue, yellow, and so on, and not circular is implied by all of circular's contraries, triangular, square, pentagonal, and so on. So here's a picture of the differences between the kinds of difference corresponding to different kinds of negation that I've been talking about. Here, Hegel takes determinate negation to be prior in the order of explanation to formal or abstract negation. He accordingly has that second picture in mind, understanding contradictories in terms of contraries. The tradition of extensional logic and semantics, extending from Boole through Russell to Tarski and Quine, adopts the other order of explanation, presupposing the logical concept of negation and understanding material incompatibility as contrariety in terms of formal incompatibility as contradictoriness or inconsistency. Each approach has its characteristic advantages. It's worth noting at this point that the interdefinability of contraries and contradictories, hence of determinate and abstract or formal negation, depends on the availability of a notion of implication or consequence. The Hegelian order of explanation has a native candidate. For as I already pointed out, material incompatibility underwrites a notion of entailment. Q is a consequence of P, just in case everything materially incompatible with Q is incompatible with P. If Pedro's a donkey, it follows that Pedro's a mammal, in the sense that everything incompatible with being a mammal is incompatible with being a donkey. What I'll call the Tarskian extensionalist tradition also has available a notion of implication, but it's not directly definable in terms of formal logical negation. It only becomes available if one widens the focus of the Tarskian explanatory strategy. Doing that will illuminate the metaphysical project that Hegel pursues in the perception chapter. In particular, it'll make manifest the difference between building modality in at the metaphysical ground floor, as Hegel does, and adding it only as a late-coming, perhaps even optional afterthought. Quine is somebody who thinks it's an optional afterthought, as the extensionalist tradition does. The widening of focus I have in mind is to the structure of singular terms and predicates, presenting objects and properties, that Hegel wants to argue is implicit already in the idea of determinate features presented by a feature-placing vocabulary. I'm going to call a conception of the objective world as consisting of particular objects that exhibit repeatable properties, universals, including relational ones, as having an Aristotelian structure. You should hear that as having a lowercase a. And by that I mean that I take it that it's such a common sense conception suggested by the grammar of our languages that Aristotle aims to explain using his proprietary metaphysical apparatus of individual substances and their essences and accidents. I'm after the Aristotelian explanandum rather than the explanans. And I take it that this is also the common explanatory target of Hegel's perception chapter that I'm talking about, and of the extensionalist semantic tradition that culminates in Tarskian model theory. Russell pitched the shift from traditional logics of properties to modern logics of relations as transformative, and along one important dimension, it certainly was. But that difference isn't of the first significance for the contrast that I'm concerned to draw here. There are two broad explanatory strategies available to explicate the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties. Hegel wants to explain it in terms of determinate negation, relating property-like features. And I want to illuminate that metaphysical approach by contrasting it with the extensionalist Tarskian tradition, which starts with objects understood as merely different. So we've got the Hegelian order of explanation starts with properties understood as something like properties, features, understood as exclusively different. The Tarskian one starts with objects thought of as merely different. That's the Tarskian or Quinean domain of a model. The two orders of explanation exploiting the relations between contraries and contradictories, hence between determinate and formal or abstract negation, are embedded in more encompassing converse explanatory strategies for articulating the Aristotelian object property categorical structure, rooted in the meta difference between incompatible and compatible differences. The notion of compatible difference that applies to objects, with which the metaphysical extensionalism begins, doesn't appeal to modal notions of possibility or necessity. The mere difference that characterizes elements of a domain of objects of a Tarskian model is a primitive material relation, in that it, like the contrariety with which Hegel's converse explanatory strategy begins, is not defined in terms of formal logical properties. Properties are represented in Tarskian structures as sets of objects, the extensions of properties. The indiscernibility of identicals, that is, that if objects A and B are identical, they have the same properties, just follows set theoretically from thinking about properties as sets of objects. The other direction of Leibniz's law, the identity of indiscernibles, won't follow unless one insists that every different set of objects determines or constitutes a property. I'm going to come back to those, to Leibniz's law in a couple minutes. On this basis, contradictoriness and so formal negation can be introduced in the Tractarian scheme. Contradictory properties are definable as properties with complementary extensions within the domain of merely different objects. Not P, the contradictory of P, is the property whose extension consists of all and only the objects in the domain that are not in the extension of P. The relation of contrariety is not really represented in such extensional model structures. What are intuitively contraries, such as square and circular, will have disjoint extensions, but not every pair of disjoint extensions corresponds to proper contraries. If the domain doesn't happen to include a mountain made of gold, being made of gold and being a mountain will be disjoint properties without thereby being contraries. The failure of Tarskian structures to represent contrariety is the result of the modal character of that notion. Contradictoriness of properties is represented because negation is given the same reading in all models. Contradictory properties are those pairs whose extensions exhaustively and exclusively partition the domain of objects. In order to represent contrariety of properties, we could, in this object-based framework, impose a non-logical material constraint on the Tarskian interpretation function to ensure that the extensions of contrary properties P and Q are disjoint in every model. That's in effect what the possible worlds development of Tarskian model theory does. The modal element can be thought of as added by treating contrariety of properties the way logical negation is treated in standard Tarskian model theory, as a constraint on all interpretations. Such an account moves up to intensions of properties by looking at functions from indices to extensions. The indices can be models, that is, Tarskian relational structures, or they can be possible worlds. We've actually come to see that the difference between thinking of them as model structures and thinking of them as possible worlds are great. One important difference is that models have domains of objects, of merely different objects. Possible worlds don't. Another is that some logically possible worlds, that is, combinatorially possible constellations of objects and properties, don't count as really, metaphysically, or possibly physically possible, whereas any relational structure with the right idicities can be a model. This is the point where modality gets incorporated, that is, at the end of the story. It then trickles down via the intentions of the properties to the properties. But it should be emphasized that this constraint on the Tarskian order of explanation is, from the point of view of the underlying raw materials, arbitrary and extraneous. That's where Quine comes in. One simply stipulates that the disjointness of domains of certain predicates, square and circular, is de jure, while that of others, gold and mountain, is not. Such stipulations come in at the very end of the process of semantic construction, not, as with Hegel, at the very beginning. So possible world semantics, in the end, also takes the distinction between incompatible and compatible difference, between exclusive and mere difference for granted. It just builds it in at a different level as something late coming. A particularly extreme version of the extensionalist order of explanation, something close to a reductio ad absurdum of it, is that of the Tractatus. Not only doesn't it build modality into its primitives, it offers only the most attenuated version of modality, constructed at the very end as something to be understood in terms of logical contradictoriness and so formal negation. The Tractarian scheme starts with mere difference of objects and mere difference of relations among them. Properties are understood as just relations to different objects. all elementary objects can stand in all relations to all other objects. At the ground level, there are no combinatory restrictions at all, except those that follow from the adicity of the relations. What's syntactically, combinatorially, categorically possible, logically possible, is possible to occur. Elementary objects put no constraints on the Sachverhalte that they can enter into, so no restrictions on the properties they can simultaneously exhibit. At this level, properties don't stand to one another in relations of exclusive difference. One where being, say, A's mother, one cannot be B's father. Indeed, it's a good question whether and how monadic properties can even be merely distinguished in the Tractarian scheme. More complex facts can be incompatible, but this is intelligible only where one truth functionally includes the logical negation of an elementary fact included in another. Dissatisfaction with this treatment of the contrariety of colors seems to have played an important role in moving Wittgenstein away from his Tractarian way of thinking about things. Grafting on at the end substantive modal constraints on admissible models in the way of possible world semantics doesn't alter the basic Tarskian extensionalist order of explanation. The order of explanation Hegel pursues in the perception chapter is the converse of it. It's of the essence of extensional approaches to appeal only to mere and compatible difference of objects. Besides compatible differences of features, Hegel also acknowledges incompatible or exclusive differences. And he's not addressing objects, but features, what will become visible as properties. We've seen that these come in two Aristotelian species, formal contradictories and material contraries. Hegel focuses on the material, non-logical incompatibility of such contraries. On the basis of this non-logical modal primitive, he then elaborates the full Aristotelian structure of objects with properties, particulars characterized by universals. There are three distinct further moves in the process by which the metaphysical structure of objects with properties is found to be implicit already in what would be expressed by purely feature-placing vocabulary, once the features deployed in that vocabulary are understood to stand to one another in relations of both compatible and incompatible difference. Each step involves adding to the picture a further kind of difference, so a further articulation of the complex notion of determinate negation. The first move puts in place the intercategorial difference between properties and objects, or universals and particulars. The second move puts in place an intracategorial difference between two roles that particular objects must play with respect to properties, reflecting on the side of objects the intracategorial difference between merely different and exclusively different properties. And the third move registers a fundamental intercategorial metaphysical difference between objects and properties with respect to mere and exclusive differences. So those three steps are what I want to rehearse now. The first move in this argument finds the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties, or particulars and universals, to be implicit already in the observation that the features articulating the contents of sense experience stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility, exclusive difference, or in Hegel's term, determinate negation. This argument can be thought of as beginning with the role of what, in the sense certainty chapter, Hegel calls the now, looking at the role that plays in the distinction between the two basic kinds of difference, compatible and incompatible. What would be expressed by now sub 1 is night is not incompatible with what would be expressed by now sub 2 is night. It is incompatible with now sub 1 is day. The incompatibility applies only to the same now. We could say that now is playing the role of a unit of account for incompatibilities. At this point, we can see that the notion of incompatible difference, determinate negation, or material incompatibility, I've been using these as three different ways of talking about the same thing, that notion of incompatible difference among features implicitly involves a contrast with a different kind of thing, something that is not in the same sense a feature, but is an essential part of the same structure. For incompatibilities among features require units of account. What's impossible is not that two incompatible features should be exhibited at all. After all, sometimes it's raining and sometimes it's fine. What is impossible is that they should be exhibited by the same unit of account. What we get our first grip on is what would be expressed by a tokening of a now, or a here and now, or a this, as Hegel rehearses them in sense certainty. So from the fact that what would be expressed by different nows can exhibit incompatible features, it follows that the structure of sense contents that includes features that can differ either incompatibly or compatibly also includes items that are not features but play this other role. These units of account are of a different ontological category from the features for which they are units of account. Besides the intracategorial difference concerning relations of features between two kinds of difference, incompatible and compatible, of features in sensory experience that would be expressed by sentences in a merely feature-placing language, sensory experience also implicitly involves the intercategorial difference between features and units of account for incompatibilities of features. And that is to say that what I've called the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties, or particulars and universals, is now seen to have been all along implicit in sense experience, even as originally conceived according to the categories of sense certainty. Making this implicit structure explicit yields the form of sensory self-consciousness that Hegel calls perception. At this point, a decisive line has been crossed. The content repeatables exhibited by unrepeatable sense experiencing are no longer to be construed as features, but as properties. What enforces the transition is the association of these sense repeatables not with what's expressed by the indiscriminate it of its raining, or the undifferentiated, merely existential there is of there is red, but with different competing units of account. Looking over the shoulder of the phenomenal self-consciousness that's developing from the categories of sense certainty to those of perception in Hegel's story, we see that this differentiation of what exhibits the sense repeatables was implicit already in the different nows acknowledged by sense certainty from the beginning of the first chapter. No longer are the contents of basic sensory knowings construed as what would be expressed in feature-placing vocabularies. Now they're articulated as what requires expression in vocabularies exhibiting the further structure of subjects and predicates. What's experienced is understood not just as features, but as objects with properties, particulars exhibiting universals. Understanding functional units of account for incompatible sense repeatables, more specifically as objects or particulars, involves further unfolding what's implicit in distinguishing compatible or merely different sense repeatables from incompatible or exclusively different ones. Hegel says of the features that, quote, these determinatenesses are really only properties by virtue of the addition of a determination yet to come, namely what he'll call thinghood. He elaborates that notion of thinghood along two dimensions. The thing is exclusive and the thing is inclusive. In talking about these two different roles essential to being what he calls a thing with many properties, he describes it also as, on the one hand, a one, or an excluding unity, and on the other hand, as an also, an indifferent or including unity. The unity of the units of account essentially involves this distinction and the relation between being a one and an also, an exclusive, and an inclusive unit. These correspond to the roles played by objects with respect to incompatible properties, which they exclude, and their role with respect to compatible properties, which they include. So the intracategorial meta difference between two kinds of difference, between what now show up as properties, is reflected by the intracategorial difference between two complementary roles objects play with respect to those properties, as repelling incompatible properties and as a medium unifying a set of compatible properties. As to the first, he says, if the many determinate properties were strictly indifferent to one another, if they were simply and solely self-related, they would not be determinate, for they're only determinate insofar as they differentiate themselves from one another and relate themselves to others as to their opposites. This is the by now familiar point that determinateness requires exclusive, incompatible difference and not just mere or indifferent compatible difference. He goes on, quote, yet, as thus opposed to one another, they cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, which is just as essential to them as negation. The differentiation of the properties, insofar as it's exclusive, each property negating the others, thus falls outside this simple medium. What he's talking about as the medium here is thinghood, the objects that exhibit these properties. He goes on, the one is the moment of negation. It excludes another, and it is that by which thinghood is determined as a thing. Here the point is that if A and B are different things, then one can be circular and the other triangular, one red and one green. But one and the same thing cannot have those incompatible properties. A's being circular and red excludes its being triangular or green, and objects are individuated by such exclusions. On the other hand, long quote, this abstract universal medium, which can be called simply thinghood, is nothing else than what here and now have proved themselves to be, viz., a simple togetherness of a plurality. But the many in their determinate are, in their determinateness, simple universals themselves. The salt is a simple here, and at the same time manifold. It is white and also tart, also cubical. All these many properties are in a single simple here, in which therefore they interpenetrate. And at the same time, without being separated by different heres, they do not affect each other in this interpenetration. The whiteness does not affect the cubical shape. Each leaves the others alone and is connected with them only by the indifferent also. It's also tart, also cubical. This also is thus the pure universal itself, or the medium, the thinghood, which holds them all together in this way. The thing, as the medium in which these compatible properties can coexist, is the thing as what he calls the also. It's the thing of many compatible properties, rather than the thing as excluding incompatible ones. The tokening of here that sensory consciousness, understanding itself according to the categories of sense certainty, already saw as expressing a feature of its experiencings, played this role, as well as the exclusionary one. Already in that primitive case, we can see that the medium in which these determinations permeate each other in that universality as a simple unity, but without making contact with each other. For it's precisely through participation in this universality that each is on its own indifferent to the others. As it's turned out, this abstract universal medium, which can be called thinghood itself, is none other than the here and the now, namely as a simple ensemble of the many. Along this dimension too then, thinghood, the idea of objects as an essential structural element of the structure that contains properties, shows up first in indexical form of here and nows, on its way to the full-blown logical conception of particulars exhibiting universals. The idea of sense experiencings that are determinately contentful in the sense of being not only distinguishable, but standing in relations of material incompatibility turns out implicitly to involve a structural categorical contrast between repeatable sense universals and something else. The something else is thinghood or particularity. The notion of particularity then turns out itself to involve a contrast. Quote, the simple medium is not merely an also, an indifferent unity, but it's also a one, an excluding unity. These different but complementary roles reflect within this ontological category the difference between compatible and incompatible differences within the category of properties. So in this picture, we've got the properties or universals at the top, the objects or particulars at the bottom. We started with this intracategorial difference within the category of properties between being compatibly different and incompatibly different. And now if we move down intercategorially and look at objects and particulars, we see that that's reflected in another intracategorial difference inside the category of objects now between the thing as an also, binding together the compatibly different properties, and a thing as an excluding one, excluding the incompatibly different properties. We've seen that determinateness demands the identity and individuation of properties. Not only that we not only acknowledge compatible differences between the properties, but also incompatible differences. Does the identity and individuation of objects also depend on both the role of things as unifying compatible properties and their role as excluding incompatible ones? Hegel says, quote, these diverse aspects are specifically determined. White is white only in opposition to black, and so on. And the thing is a one precisely by being opposed to others. But it is not as a one that it excludes others from itself. It is through its determinateness that the thing excludes others. Things are therefore in and for themselves determinate. They have properties by which they distinguish themselves from others. The first claim here is that the thing as a one is in some sense opposed to other things or excludes them from itself. Talk of the thing as an excluding one invokes the role of objects as the units of account for incompatibilities of properties. But in the sense in which objects exclude or are opposed to other objects, it can't be the same sense in which properties exclude or oppose one another. I mean, for instance, what would the units of account for those exclusions be? The exclusions by one object of another object. More deeply, though, we've seen that the material contrariety of properties admits of the definition of opposites in the sense of contradictories. Property Q is the opposite of property P in this sense, just in case it's exhibited by all and only the objects that do not exhibit P. That's how not red is related to red. An argument due to Aristotle shows that objects do not have opposites in the sense of contradictories. The corresponding notion of an opposite in the ontological category of objects would have object B being the contradictory or opposite of object A, just in case B exhibits all and only the properties not exhibited by A. After all, the not red, the opposite in the category of properties of red, is exhibited by all and only the objects that don't exhibit red. But the properties not exhibited by any object always include properties that are incompatible with one another, and hence not all exhibitable by any one object. The red circular object does not exhibit the properties of being green, yellow, triangular, or rectangular. So its opposite would have to exhibit all of those properties, as well as all the other colors and shapes besides red and circular, and that's impossible. Hegel's phenomenology as an object has the properties of not being identical to my left little finger and not being identical to Bach's second Brandenburg concerto. Its opposite would have to have the property of being identical to both. Since they're not identical to each other, that can't be. So although objects both differ from, and in some sense, both merely differ from, and in some sense exclude one another, there's a huge structural difference between how they do and how properties differ from and exclude one another. The distinction between two kinds of difference that kicks off the whole process of explicitation and elaboration that we've been rehearsing. The Aristotelian argument unfolds what turns out to have been implicit all along in the distinction between two ontological categories of properties and objects. The key to the difference, the distinction between them, lies in their relation to exclusive difference, the difference between their relations to this kind of difference. That is, properties are related to exclusive difference differently than objects are related to exclusive difference. How are we to think of objects as being identified and individuated by contrast to the way properties are? The answer Hegel offers in the passage I read a minute ago is surely right as far as it goes. They're identified and individuated by their properties. This response reinforces the order of explanation being identified here as Hegel's, from or properties to objects, reversing the extensionalist Tarskian order of explanation, which starts with merely different objects and builds up from there. In virtue of their role as hosting co-compatible properties, objects as alsos merely differ from one another insofar as they host different sets of co-compatible properties. In virtue of their role as excluding properties incompatible with those they host, objects as excluding ones exclude one another insofar as some of the co-compatible properties exhibited by one object are incompatible with some of the co-compatible properties exhibited by another. Here we see another aspect of the contrast in orders of explanation between the Tarskian extensionalist tradition and Hegel's metaphysics of universals and particulars. The extensionalist tradition offers an answer to the question about how the identity and individuation of objects relates to that of properties, Leibniz's law. It comprises two parts, a weaker and a stronger claim. First part of Leibniz's law, the indiscernibility of identicals, and the second part, the identity of indiscernibles. The first one says that identical objects must have all the same properties. The second one says that objects with all the same properties are identical. The identity of indiscernibles is stronger than the indiscernibility of identicals in that it seems to depend on there being enough properties, enough to distinguish all the objects that are really distinct. As it arises in the extensionalist framework, Leibniz's law appeals only to the mere difference of properties, which is based on the mere difference of objects. It becomes controversial how to apply it when modally robust properties are in the picture. But how do these principles look in an environment where exclusive difference of properties is also in play, as well as the mere difference? The indiscernibility of identicals says that mere difference of properties is sufficient for mere difference of objects. The identity of indiscernibles says that merely different objects have at least merely different properties. I do think Hegel endorses these principles, but his talk of objects as excluding one another suggests that he also endorses a further stronger principle. Different objects not only have different properties, they have incompatible properties. We might call this modal principle the exclusivity of objects. Such a view satisfies three criteria of adequacy, the first two of which are set by the passage that I quoted most recently. It underwrites talk of objects as excluding one another. It does so by appeal to the more primitive notion of properties excluding one another, and it respects the differences between property exclusion and object exclusion that are enforced by the Aristotelian argument, which shows that objects cannot have contradictories, opposites, definable from their exclusions, in the case of properties, their contrarieties, in the way that properties do. In effect, the exclusivity of objects says that it never happens that two objects are distinguished by their role as things as alsos, combining different compatible properties, according to the discernibility of non-identicals version of LL2, unless they're also distinguished by their role as things as excluding ones. There is no mere difference of properties distinguishing objects without exclusive difference of properties having incompatible properties distinguishing them. This is a topic on which Leibniz's law is silent. Now, the principle of exclusivity of objects does hold even within the extensional context, provided logical vocabulary is available. Recall, we saw that defining contraries in terms of contradictories requires the expressive resources of both negation and a conditional. For even in the Tarskian extensional setting, it's denied that two objects could differ, merely differ, just by having different, merely or compatibly different properties. Taking our cue from the appeal to identity properties used to illustrate the Aristotelian argument that objects cannot have contradictories, we can notice that if A and B are indeed not identical, then A will have the property of being identical to A, and B will have the property of being identical to B. And if they're not identical, then nothing can have both properties. They're not merely different properties. Those identity properties are exclusively different. It's impossible for any object that has the one property to have the other. Now your logic has to have the expressive resources of formulating those identity properties as well, if you're going to get the exclusivity of objects. So thinking about things from the extensionalist direction, beginning with mere differences of objects and identifying merely different properties, in effect with sets of them, does yield a version of the principle of exclusivity of objects. If object A is red and object B differs from it by not having that property, then appeal to the notion of formal or abstract negation yields the result that B has the property that's the contradictory of red. It has the property not red, and that property is exclusively different from red, in that it's a property of formal negation, that it's logically impossible for any object to have both properties simultaneously. Provided that logical vocabulary such as identity, negation, is available to define complex properties, merely different objects will be exclusively different in the extensionalist story. The fact that the principle of exclusivity of objects, that merely different objects will have not only compatibly different properties, but also incompatibly different ones, arises early in the Hegelian order of explanation and late in the extensionalist one, is a consequence and reflection of the two orders of explanation regarding the relations between material contrariety and formal contradictoriness that they adopt. The Hegelian order of explanation has no need to appeal to what is expressed by formal logical vocabulary. For distinguishing at the outset compatibly from incompatibly different properties, as Hegel does, commits one to a picture of properties as coming in compatible families of incompatible properties, as in the paradigmatic case of shapes and colors, of monochromatic Euclidean plane figures. If objects A and B differ in merely compatible properties, they differ in properties drawn from different families of incompatibles. A is red and B is square. But for them to be distinguished from each other thereby, A must not also be square and B must not also be red. And if A is not square, it'll exhibit some other shape incompatible with being square. And if B is not red, it'll exhibit some other color incompatible with being red. But then A and B will have properties that are not merely different from one another, but incompatible. That's just what the exclusivity of objects claims. According to this picture, kinds of things are characterized by which compatible families of incompatible properties they exhibit. In a sense, then, for the identity and individuation of objects, the exclusiveness of objects, which appeals to the exclusive difference of properties, is more basic in the Hegelian order of explanation than Leibniz's law is, because Leibniz's law appeals to mere difference of properties. Modality, what's impossible and what's necessary, is built in at the beginning of Hegel's story as a feature of determinate negation. It's more basic explanatorily and so conceptually the non-modal formal logical vocabulary, such as abstract negation. This observation completes the rehearsal of the argument that elaborates what's implicit in the idea of the contents of sensory consciousness as what would be expressed in feature-placing vocabulary, through the consideration of what's implicit in the requirement that the features articulating those contents must be determinate, through the consideration of the relation of negation and universality, to the much more finely structured idea of those contents as presenting a world consisting of empirical objects with many properties. We're now in a position to understand what Hegel's after, when in the opening paragraphs of the perception chapter, he says such things as, perception takes what's present to it as a universal. As it's turned out, it's merely the character of positive universality which is at first observed and developed. Only perception contains negation. Being is a universal in virtue of its having mediation or the negative within it. When it expresses this in its immediacy, it's a differentiated, determinate property. Since the principle of the object, the universal, is in its simplicity a mediated universal, the object must express this its nature in its own self. This it does by showing itself to be the thing with many properties. The passage I want to focus on at this point is one in which Hegel summarizes what we'll learn by talking about, quote, sensuous universality, that is, the immediate unity of being and the negative. For here he's announcing that in the perception chapter, we get our introduction to one of his master ideas, that determinateness should be understood as a kind of identity constituted by difference, a unity articulated by disparity. Though he has other big ideas, this is the central structural innovation of his thought about what he calls logic, which only later in the story is differentiated into a semantics addressing the structure of subjective thought on the one hand, and an ontology or metaphysics addressing the structure of objective being, the objective realm of being. One of my main interpretive claims is the determinate negation or material incompatibility on the side of thinking subjects is deontic incompatibility, a matter of commitment and entitlement. And on the side of objects, the objects thought about, it's alethic incompatibility, a matter of necessity and possibility. And that Hegel's idealism is a story about the unity constituted by these different kinds of differences. But that's a story for a different occasion. What we've been exploring is the metaphysical fine structure of what Hegel invokes in this passage as the negative. One of his own summaries is, the thing as the truth of perception reaches its culmination, it is alpha, the indifferent passive universality, the also of the many properties. Beta, the negation generally is simple, that is the one, the excluding of contrasted properties. And gamma, the many properties themselves, the relations of the first two moments, the negation as it relates itself to the indifferent element and extends itself within it as a range of differences, the point of individuality in the medium of enduring existence radiating out into multiplicity. In fact, I've argued that Hegel's metaphysical analysis of the fine structure of the Aristotelian object with many properties and his derivation of it from the concept of determinate universality is substantially more intricate than even this summary indicates. As on offer in the perception chapter, Hegel's concept of negation is a constellation of no fewer than 10 interrelated kinds of difference. We began by distinguishing mere or indifferent difference of compatible universals from two, exclusive difference of incompatible universals. And that brought into view three, the meta difference between mere and exclusive difference. This is the first intracategorial meta difference, between differences relating universals to universals. It's a kind of exclusive difference, since the universals must be either incompatible or compatible, but not both. Within exclusive difference, there are two species that can be related by two opposing orders of explanation. 4, material contrariety, corresponding to determinate negation, and 5, formal contradictoriness, corresponding to abstract logical negation. Think about that second picture that I put up. There is then also 6, the meta difference between determinate and abstract negation, or logical negation. This is the second intracategorial meta difference between differences relating universals to universals. These are not exclusively, but only compatibly different. Contradictories are a kind of contrary, namely minimal contraries. But implicit in the concept of repeatables as universals is 7, the difference between universals and particulars. This is the first intercategorial difference. It too is a kind of exclusive difference. Can't be both an object and a property. Implicit in the concept of particulars in relation to universals is 8, the difference between two roles that objects play. Particulars as alsos, that is, as a medium hosting a community of compatible universals, and particulars as exclusive ones, that is, as units of account repelling incompatible properties. That's the first intracategorial difference between roles played by particulars. Corresponding to this difference on the side of particulars is 9, the difference between two roles universals play with respect to particulars. Universals as related to an inclusive one in community with other compatible universals. That's the first difference, aufgehoben. And second, universals as excluding incompatible universals associated with different exclusive ones. That's distinction 2, aufgehoben. And finally, there is 10, the difference between universals and particulars that consists in the fact that universals do and particulars do not have contradictories or opposites. Unless the distinctions and intricate interrelations between these different ways in which things can be said to differ from or negate each other are kept firmly in mind, nothing but confusion can result in thinking about Hegel's metaphysics of negation. As an illustration, both determinate properties and objects can be understood as, to use a favorite Hegelian phrase, negations of the negation, but in very different ways according to what's negated and the kind of negating of it, drawn from that list that I just displayed. For instance, the first negating of a negation is intracategorial among universals. They are the determinate universals, they are by excluding others. And in the second case, it's intercategorial, distinguishing particulars from universals. In the first case, the identity of a determined property consists in how it differs from its material contraries. Each is in sense 2 the negation of the property in question, and it is by being the contrary of or negating all of its exclusive contraries that it's the determinate property that it is. In the second case, the sense in which the object is the negation of the negation, according to the order of explanation I've attributed to Hegel, particulars are understood in terms of their exclusive difference of type 7 and 9 from universals. Since the universals are the determinate universals they are because of their negations of one another, particulars can be understood as negations of negations that articulate those universals. They're of the category that does not negate others of its category in the way that universals do negate others of their category. These two examples of kinds of identity that are intelligible as constituted by negating a negation are obviously quite different due to the difference in the kinds of negation. So we've seen Hegel argue that the idea that sense experience has a determinate content implicitly involves the idea that such contents can differ from one another in two different ways. And we've seen how he argues that the whole Aristotelian structure of objects with properties is implicit in the relations between these two kinds of difference, these two senses in which contents can negate one another. This result is a case study concerning how Hegel thinks a more complex structure can be understood as implicit in a simpler one. that understanding is articulated and enacted in the process by which one goes about making that implicit structure explicit. And that's what I've rehearsed for you today.